There are several ways that we can carry tender plants over the winter from one season to the next. If plants produce a bulb, we can dig and store these bulbs. Over the next few weeks, I'll look at different ways of storing bulbs from different types of plants. Today I want to focus on plants that can be wintered in containers. Now this is the most likely way that we're going to overwinter our tropical plants that we've brought outdoors, such as our tropical hibiscus, our cordylines, some of our tender agaves, and our succulents. Plants that are already in a container, we could just bring these containers right indoors and store them more or less as a house plant over the winter months. One thing you'll want to do before you bring these inside is to tip the plants out and look for insects, snakes, or any other critters who have made that container their home. Now we can also dig up plants from the landscape and bring these indoors. A number of plants that we grow as annuals in the landscape are actually tender perennials. Joseph's coat, this Persian shield, Stribolanthes, and Kufia are good examples of tender perennials that we can actually dig up and bring indoors for the winter. Now after a season of growth, many of these have grown quite large, and so we want to start by trimming back the foliage. And we can take quite a bit of foliage off. We want to cut it back so that we're removing up to 1/2 or even 2/3 of the foliage. We want to make sure we don't cut back to bare stems. We will need a little bit of foliage left on the plant so the plant can continue to photosynthesize. But what we're doing is reducing the amount of foliage that is remaining where the plant will lose water. We're also making a smaller plant, which will be much easier for us to pot up and to bring indoors. Now as you're going through this process, you want to look at the foliage that's remaining and make sure there aren't any insects on there. If you do find insects, you could use a stream of water to try to wash that off. You can also try a product that's safe for indoor use, such as a horticultural oil or a horticultural soap, and spray the plant to kill any insects. Once you've trimmed back the foliage, we could go ahead and dig up the plant. And I'm actually going to remove there's a little bit of mulch in the way. I'm going to remove the soil from the root ball, but I still want to dig fairly far out from the plant so that I could get the whole root system. And one of the reasons that I want to remove this is native soil can be really heavy in a container, and we want to replace this with a nice loose potting soil. So we're going to bring the plant out and shake off the excess soil. You can still see some of the original potting soil in there. Now if you have a very extensive root system, you're going to need to trim back some of those roots so that it could fit inside of our container. This one's not too bad, but don't be shy. It's okay to go in and cut the roots off. A lot of people worry about that. They're going to stress the plant out too much. We will stress it a little bit, but we're bringing it indoors to a nice protected environment where we could take good care of it. So it's not going to be a huge concern for us. You want to find a nice decorative pot if you have one. And I need to put a little bit of soil in the bottom. This root system doesn't quite make it all the way down. And I'm using a real light potting media. It has some perlite in it, which will help with drainage. And put your plant inside the container and then fill in soil around it. Okay, we want to continue to fill until the soil level reaches about a 1/2 inch below the surface. Whenever we pot plants, I like to bring the soil up so it's about a half inch, and then as I water, it'll settle down a little bit, and that'll give us about 1 inch at the top. It's nice to leave a little bit of room at the top so that we can water our plants easily without overflowing. Now as you fill, you want this plant to be firmly set in here, so I am using my hands to push it down firmly, and as we water, it'll also settle in a little bit more. Okay, Now, during the first few days, this plant is going to probably wilt a little bit. It's undergone a little bit of stress, but it will rebound. You do want to watch and make sure that you're irrigating it regularly, that you're watering your plant. But one of the things that we tend to do is actually overwater our plants, so be careful not to give it too much love. We want to look for a location indoors that will receive the brightest light possible. Usually a south-facing window is the best place to keep our potted plants. Now, when we plant all of our plants up in a container, they can take up quite a bit of room. There's another way we could bring our plants indoors, and that's by taking cuttings. Rooting plants from cutting is a great way to winter some of those plants that get quite large in the landscape, like our lantana and our coleus. Now, both of these will root very easily from cuttings. We want to start by preparing our soil, and you can use a rooting medium, or I'm just using a regular potting soil. It is fairly light. There's some bark and there's some perlite in it, which helps loosen it up, and it also has a good water holding capacity. And I like to start by getting my soil wet. It can be hard and slow to get your soil wet at first. You see how the water's just pooling up, and it takes a while to soak in. Now this one I had already put some water in, and you can see with the second one, it'll suck that water in much more quickly. It's a really good idea to wet the soil thoroughly, because we're eventually going to want a nice damp environment. And once that settles in, I'm going to use a pen or a pencil to create a little hole. And this is going to be my planting hole where I put the cutting. Let's take a look at the cutting material. When we're doing a cutting, we want to cut our stem right below a node. And a node is where the leaves attach to the stem here. So I'm going to make a cut just below that. And then we want to peel off the leaves from the bottom two nodes. These nodes are an area of high activity. That's where the leaves come out of there, but that's also going to be the location where our roots develop. And so we want to expose two of those, and we're going to put that into the soil for rooting. The next thing I want to use is a hormone. And there are several different strengths of hormone. This is a rooting powder. You can get this at a garden center or some florists. And I'm using number 1, which is a weaker rooting hormone. It's for herbaceous cuttings. And there's stronger hormones with a higher number, and we use those more for our woody cuttings, which we would take earlier in the year. So we want to dip the bottom of the stem, the cut part, into that rooting hormone. And cover it well, shake off the excess. And then we're going to put it into the soil. Remember, we want to cover both of those bottom nodes. And we're going to tap the soil in gently around it. Now at this point, you might want a little bit more water, and I like to apply it with a squirt bottle. Make sure that it's set firmly in the pot. I also want to remember to put a label in. It's very easy to get your cultivars mixed up. By springtime, you forget what lantana was that I took a cutting of. Now, I did want to shift focus real quickly and look at the lantanas. This plant has some flowers on it, and if we're rooting a cutting, we don't want flowers because they will compete with the plant for energy. And so I'm going to look up and down this stem. There's some smaller buds. This one's already producing a fruit. I don't want any of the plant's energy to be going into flowering or fruiting. So I'm just going to go through and trim all of those flowers off. And even as your plant is rooting, go back in and check and make sure there's no flowers developing on the stem. So again, I'm going to trim the lower 2 sets of leaves at the lower 2 nodes. Dip that in a rooting hormone, and make my hole and put it in. Cover that up. This one's going a little deeper because there's more space between the nodes. Now, in order for these to root, they need a humid environment. Here at the studio gardens, we have a greenhouse with a mist bench, which keeps the area around the plants nice and humid. But at home, we don't have such luxuries all the time. So we're going to create a little humid environment by putting a bag over our plant. And I want to put in a bamboo stake or a stick to hold the bag up. And a clear bag works really well. This is the type you would use for produce. And I start by just squirting a little bit of water inside the bag. The plant doesn't have any roots right now, so it can't take up water through the roots. So all the water it's going to get is going to be coming through the leaves. We don't want it to dry out, and that's why we need this nice humid environment. You could secure the bag with a rubber band, or I like to twist it and use a little clip to keep it secure. You're going to want to check on this regularly and make sure that it stays nice and damp inside of there, but not too wet. If it's really wet, we're going to end up with mold on the leaves. So humid, but not dripping. Now after a few weeks, it could take different plants take different lengths of time to root. Coleus are pretty quick. You'll certainly have it rooted probably within 2 weeks. Others might take 3 to 4 weeks. And what you could do is once it's in, go in and gently pull the stem. And this one obviously doesn't have any roots. It moves very easily. But once it becomes rooted, when you pull on it, it'll resist and it won't lift up easily out of the pot. And that's how you know it's rooted. At that point, you could put your plant into a very sunny location, just as we did with our dug and potted plant, and enjoy it until the springtime. As it grows, it might outgrow its little container and need to be potted up to a larger pot.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.